And good morning, everyone, or evening, good night, maybe to certain locations. My name is Alex Grach. I'm from AppsFlyer, and today I'm going to talk about the state of mobile gaming in 2020. And I guess to begin with, I think it is very important for us all to acknowledge the fact that even though we are going to talk about growth and opportunity, the events of the past few months came at a very significant human cost, right? And I think we need to be very mindful about that. When it comes to mobile gaming and the app economy in general, 2020, it is definitely going to be a test year for us. And if we try to look into the past and draw some parallels when it comes to 2008 financial crisis, the funny thing that we can't really do that, right? So app economy is so young, so we didn't really we haven't been through a recession yet. So we definitely can draw some parallels from video gaming industry performance in 2008, which was pretty solid, but still mobile free to play was not really there, right? So in this case, I think what's very interesting for us all now is to look very attentively to the state of the market at the moment, and course correct the strategies and essentially be very agile when it comes to everything that we are doing. When it comes to the present, and definitely we all saw a significant increase in sofa time in terms of us being in under lockdowns, and we saw a massive increase in engagement and usage of different apps, and I guess more importantly mobile gaming apps as well. But it is also interesting to kind of classify the sofa time or the past few months into two very distinct phases, right? So the phase number one was the initial lockdown, when we all found quite a few additional time at our disposal, but the financial situation was not really impacted. Which we can't really say about the second phase of the lockdown, when quite a few people lost their jobs, and they were coming under increased pressure when it comes to the financial situation, and definitely we see that sentiment in the data as well. Moving forward, as I said earlier, it is kind of hard to predict, but definitely what we see now, that even though the revenues and growth is distributed unevenly, we should all be proud of the fact that the mobile industry in general is serving as a very good partner to everybody during this lockdowns, right? Be it a gaming app that is delivering entertainment, be it health and fitness categories that delivering health benefits and peace of mind at times. We don't have a crystal ball yet, but we can definitely say that the mobile economy is doing some very positive things for the mankind during this kind of recession. So let me introduce AppsFlyer a little bit, and we are a global leader in mobile attribution marketing analytics space. Essentially, we are helping game developers make a smarter decision when it comes to scaling their user acquisition activities, optimizing their campaigns, and essentially driving better users to their games. We are truly a global company with 18 offices around the globe at the moment, close to 1,000 employees strong. We work with 75,000 different app developers and close to 6,000 different integrated partners. It's also important to note that we are measuring almost 1 trillion events on a daily basis, which is really crazy number, absolutely, when it comes to the volumes. Talking about myself, I run our sales team in EMEA. We do have a very strong presence across Europe and Middle East as well, and working very closely with our clients from all parts of the region, and very happy to speak with you now in this virtual PCG edition. When it comes to the data sample that I will be sharing with you today, it's also important to to describe how did we prepare that data, right? So first of all, we will be looking at close to 5 billion organic installs and close to 3 billion non-organic installs. In terms of the app sessions measurements, we've measured 1.4 trillion different sessions, and we will also be breaking down the genres into hyper casual, casual, midcore, hardcore, and social casinos, right? So you'll see different kind of insights for every single category. When it comes to this those phases that I spoke about earlier, it's interesting that when we look at the lockdown phase one, right, this initial period that we can basically started at the end of February and lasted until the first week of April, we saw quite a substantial increase across all gaming categories, right? We saw a 37% increase, which could be also attributed to the fact that during this initial lockdown phase, a lot of businesses scaled down their acquisition, right? So e-commerce, travel, and all categories being hit very hard by the coronavirus, essentially allowed gaming apps to scale pretty nicely. But what we see during the second phase of the lockdown is a correction, right? So we saw negative 12% growth when it comes to user acquisition, and it could be attributed to the fact that advertisers are becoming more cautious when it comes to the looming recession, and potentially adopting more conservative strategies when it comes to UA. I have to say that on our website we are running a very interesting updates report on COVID-related impacts to different industries. We are updating data on a monthly basis, so you can very soon you will be able to see the most fresh data for June. And I would really recommend you guys to go on our website and basically monitor that situation. You'll be able to break it down into different genres, different geographies, and essentially find very interesting insights in addition to what we are going to talk about today. Let's look at some of the global trends, right? So and over here again, if we look at those kind of two phases of the lockdown, we see that globally we kind of peaked around in terms of the ad spend, we kind of peaked on the border of those two. When it comes to specific genres, and I wanted to look into casual specifically, it's interesting to notice here that we kind of started to scale with non-organic installs, and we definitely saw some increase from pre-lockdown situation when it comes to both organic and non-organic installs. But then towards the end of the second phase, we started to see regression to previous numbers. And what's also interesting is that we are seeing a faster decrease of paid acquisition comparing to organic acquisition, which is pretty interesting when it comes to the sessions and revenue data, which kind of following a similar trend for global casual space. But if we look at hardcore, for example, we definitely saw a similar trend. Maybe not that evident, but definitely a similar trend in terms of the growth of non-organic installs and organic installs as well. But if we look at the session and revenue data for hardcore, it's interesting to see that it did not really change, to be honest. And maybe that's partially the fact that hardcore gamers are hardcore in general, right? So they do not really care for lockdowns and pandemics. But it's interesting to see that the hardcore space is not really being impacted in terms of the sessions and revenue. To summarize this kind of phased out approach, what's interesting is that we definitely are seeing the normalization recently, but on top of that, it is very important we do not have any crystal balls at this moment of time, right? We are expecting a significant recession in the economy. Definitely, the gaming industry so far is performing pretty nicely, but we see declining trend in both in revenue and in acquisition as well, right? And once again, I think in the next few months we'll have more data to back it up and to see how the situation is going to play out essentially. Moving forward, I also wanted to spend some time and talk about some of the differences that we saw in the beginning of 2020 comparing to 2019, and what could we kind of expect when it comes to the growth comparing to 2019 pre-lockdown. When it comes to user acquisition and specifically the share of paid acquisition across different genres, it is important to note that it is very, very hard to compete in the current App Store environment, right? So organic growth is very complicated, and we see pretty much all categories increasing the share of paid acquisition in their overall user acquisition mix, right? So casual and hyper casual hyper-casual genres are showing double-digit growth when it comes to the year-over-year change. Hardcore and social casinos are a little bit below that, but in general, it is something that definitely manifests itself as a major pattern, right? Paid acquisition is something that really drives game developers, and they are engaging in that in higher volumes. When it comes to retention, and specifically when it comes to uninstalls, the situation is pretty challenging as well, right? Because if you look at, for example, hardcore and hyper casual space, average uninstall rate per app is 65%, which is pretty significant. When it comes to mid-core and casual, it's in its 50s, and social casino is a little bit below 50. So definitely we need to find some additional strategies of how we can work with retargeting and making those users stay within the app and engage better. In terms of the growth markets, I also wanted to have a look today at some of the markets that are driving the growth in different genres. When it comes to casual space, we see quite surprisingly very, very strong performance in the Middle East, right? So we see Egypt and Saudi Arabia leading the charge there. So close to 220% growth year over year in those markets. Mexico is performing strongly, Spain and France as well. South Africa, China and Norway are also working pretty solid. When it comes to the hyper casual space, it is interesting to see a staggering growth in the United States, right? So close to 650% growth in the United States when it comes to the hyper casual segment. But all the usual suspects are still there. Russia, Brazil, APAC countries are performing very nicely as well. If we move on to the mid-core, mid-core is to a certain extent similar to casual, where we see Egypt and Saudi Arabia in general, Middle Eastern and the APAC countries growing very, very nicely in 300% kind of volumes. And if you are not currently looking at those countries, I would highly recommend reaching out to some of your partners to maybe introduce you to media sources that are performing strongly in those geos, and you should definitely try doing something there at least as a test potentially. Let's move on to the hardcore segment as well, and the hardcore is growing pretty strongly as well in its 60% year over year in different markets, right? So we see LATAM performing strongly, once again Middle East and APAC delivering an interesting growth as well. In social casino, quite similar situation. China growing strongly, 240% year over year, and in this case, LATAM could be um, a very interesting market for social casino developers as well. I'd like to talk a little bit about retargeting as well, because retargeting is often not in the toolkit of a game developer, right? For various reasons, retargeting, game developers not really doing a lot of retargeting, but the changes, some of the changes in circumstances of app users that we saw during the lockdowns could potentially present an opportunity for game developers to start doing retargeting as well. Here, I would like to drive your attention to an interesting chart that essentially talks about the trend of the retargeting trend that we see across our user base. And in this case, you see essentially the percentage of apps running retargeting campaigns across different markets, right? So we have very interesting trends in shopping and lifestyle, but gaming was sort of flat, right? So we see more or less 15% of game developers doing retargeting, but as I said earlier, this is something that presents a very interesting opportunity moving forward, because if we look at the RPPU KPI, average revenue per paying user, we definitely see some interesting data over there. And for example, when it comes to the hardcore genre, we see that the apps that are running retargeting in the hardcore space are on average getting 95% more RPPU comparing to the apps that are not running it. Of course, every single app is different, and you should be very, very mindful when it comes to running this, when it comes to running retargeting. But we definitely see companies having an increased appetite towards retargeting in the gaming space as well. Next thing is revenue, and when it comes to revenue, it's also quite interesting to look at the COVID effect on different revenue streams that we saw across different genres. It has been a trend that many developers were playing around with advertising monetization strategies, even if advertising is not really the core monetization strategy of the game. But what's interesting is that if we compare March to January, we saw quite a substantial increase in IAP revenue, and when it comes to in-app advertising, we saw pretty significant declines, right? Specifically in the mid-core and hardcore segments, where the decline was close to 20%. We definitely are going to continue to monitor this trend, because more and more advertisers are looking for creative ways of some sort of a hybrid monetization, and it is definitely interesting to see how the pandemic essentially is affecting the advertising revenue when it comes to monetization. It is very natural to talk about fraud moving forward, because it has been quite a significant challenge for many developers throughout the past few years. But when it comes to app install fraud, we definitely see that currently it is not really a major challenge, not really a major threat to most games. If you compare it to non-gaming categories, where it is much more profound, we see that casual and mid-core genres are always don't have any fraud, right? When it comes to the app install fraud these days, hardcore and social casinos are experiencing a bit of a higher numbers of fraud, but in general, this, as I said, this is not really the major trend. What's interesting though is that in-app event fraud is emerging as a much more challenging threat to most game developers. When we talk about in-app event fraud, we talk about some sophisticated behaviors that fraudsters are trying to mimic legitimate users' behavior within your apps, either generate certain revenue-related activity, or maybe try to mimic the game playing behavior. And essentially, if you are not really attentive to this types of fraud, and still looking at the app install fraud, I would definitely recommend you start measuring much more events when it comes to your when it comes to looking at your paid acquisition performance, but also start using some machine learning techniques and AI algorithms that are available on the market now as well, to see if you can catch those behavioral fraud within the downstream from the in-app from the installation of the app, essentially. I'd like to sum it up in a few key takeaways, I guess. So first thing is that, as we discussed, IEPs are becoming increasingly important. It is interesting to see if the in-app advertising revenue is going to bounce back for the genres where we saw a significant decline. But definitely IEPs are also potentially going to be affected if they are considered somehow as a luxury good, potentially moving forward when the recession is going to be more pronounced. Developing markets are presenting an interesting opportunity as well, right? So we saw amazing performance in Egypt and the Middle East in general, and we definitely see some game developers and app developers having very good results coming out of those markets. Second trend is retargeting, and as I said, probably your users back in the day when you tried doing retargeting, you didn't see any incremental lift. The circumstances of your users might have changed, and they might be very much responsive to retargeting these days, right? So I would definitely recommend trying some retargeting strategies, and definitely testing a few retargeting partners potentially. Then in-app event fraud. In-app event fraud has been sort of overlooked by the industry for some time, when people were mostly dealing with different install hijacking mechanics and trying to simulate click time to install kind of fraud. But fraudsters are becoming much more sophisticated and definitely trying to mimic the behavior of existing users. So let's all be very attentive to downstream fraud, and try to once again try to test things and be more attentive with what kind of events you're tracking. And the final remark here, I'd say, is once again, we don't have a crystal ball here, right? So it's very hard to drive any parallels with the previous recession we've been to. Yes, gaming industry performed very nicely in 2008 recession, but mobile free-to-play is completely different, and we definitely should be very attentive to what the nature brings to us forward, right? So I'd like to thank you guys for your time, and I'll be very happy to answer any questions that you might have. I think we have some 5 minutes left.
Yeah, we have a couple of minutes. That was great. Thank you for that presentation. That's really good. I know it's really tough trying to pace it and do it without that feedback. Even when people don't say anything in a physical room, it's just seeing humans. It's so unbelievable how different the experience is. But yeah, obviously we've got some questions, and I'll run through a couple of them now. So I'll try and tie stuff together. So I've got an anonymous question to start with. Someone says it's interesting that casual games and advertising are both trending down. I think on one of your earlier wasn't marketing, but he'd have thought, or she'd have thought that that new audiences in this kind of COVID time would mean a big increase in casual and hyper casual players. Is that an observation? Maybe it's a question, but yeah.
It's yeah, definitely. Once again, if we look at this additional time that we had at our disposal, right? We were thinking that more and more people are going to play, and more and more people are going to engage with apps. But what's interesting is, as I showed, right, that we sort of peaked when it comes to the engagement around the around the beginning of the second phase of the lockdown, and then we are kind of going down towards the pre-lockdown positions in certain industries. But I think what's more kind of alarming maybe is that if you look at the paid acquisition, you definitely saw some rallies by game developers in the beginning when a lot of different competing categories scaled down. But then people started to adopt much more conservative strategies, right? And from my let's say personal conversations with a number of game developers, we definitely see certain let's say caution when it comes to investing more in UA at this point of time, right? Because yes, the engagement and revenues might be kind of on a better trend, but people are still not very let's say not very bullish when it comes to making additional investments during let's say in the wake of the potential recession, right? So that's basically I think it's more of a let's say kind of mental problem on the side of user acquisition managers.
So that does that answer another question is here from John Cook said ad spend up, ad monetization down. He said that seems counterintuitive. Is that kind of in the same ballpark? I don't know why you saw ad spend up. I'm just a messenger.
Yeah, I think it was actually quite the opposite, right? So we saw that the ad spend was up during the first phase of the lockdown, right? So we saw ad spend growing. Then we saw that the ad spend actually is scaling down, but for certain categories, the monetization stayed the same, right? I think when the point about ad spend down was related to the advertising revenue that we saw for hardcore and midcore developers, right? So we saw that for some reason, if we compare the lockdown period with January, ad revenue monetization was down for some reason. Now we have to monitor it closely, but I wonder if the participants see a similar trend for their apps as well.
Okay, yeah, no, it's there's a lot of interesting. It's still quite raw, the data. There's a lot of interesting things coming out. I guess in a continuing vein, there's a question here asking whether you believe in the long run, with the increase of unemployment rates and possible recession. I don't think it's a possible recession. I think it's a pretty definite recession. The decline will be more radical in the games business as well. Again, you said you haven't got a crystal ball. You kind of mentioned that a couple of times.
Yeah.
But is there anything you think games developers can do to prepare themselves for that?
Sure. I think it is definitely interesting to look at the different monetization strategies, right? Because again, if we draw some parallels with the 2008 crisis, right, we saw that video games performed very, very nicely, right? But again, if we compare video games to mobile free to play, right, these are two very different products in a way, right? You can buy let's say a video game and it gives you hours and hours of entertainment, right, that can potentially substitute going to movies, watching whatever TV shows and things like that. Whereas free to play essentially is a service, right? You need to spend, and it's a different discussion, right? Pay to win discussions and things like that. But definitely we can probably anticipate that to a certain extent the usage is going to stay the same. But the revenues might scale down, right? Because people still want to engage, people still want to entertain themselves, but the situation with monetization will remain unclear, to be honest, right? Definitely we see certain advertisers outside of the gaming space not being very bullish when it comes to advertising these days. We just have to see how it's going to play out, to be honest. But
okay.
Yeah,
we're going to try and squeeze in two more. We're a little bit over time. Mike Rose will have to be patient. I'm sure he'll be fine. But I think it's when we've got live. It's good to have discussion going on. I think there's a couple of kind of questions here about ad fraud. One is what is in-app event fraud, and the other is, are there certain genres or demographics that have seen a larger share of in-app fraud, or certain types of IAP are more likely to be fraudulently removed?
So when it comes to the first question, let's maybe define in-app events fraud, right? So basically, when it comes to in-app events, mobile developers select what kind of events they wish to measure, right? It might be level ups, it might be purchases, it might be a lot of different events that are being measured. The question is that these days it is pretty, let's say if we look at device farms, for example, right, where you have a real devices connected to the same server, they are all carrying a legitimate IP. They're downloading the game, for example, and then later on they're trying to mimic the real behavior of a user. So let's say you have the way you work with your user acquisition partners is that you are looking at retention, let's say day 3 retention or day 7 retention, and you look at the number of critical in-app events that are potentially signaling long-term ROAS for your app moving forward, right? So in this case, a lot of fraudsters these days are kind of trying to mimic those in-app event behaviors, right? So if you're looking at day 3 retention, they would try to mimic day 3 retention, right? If they're looking at certain other in-app event metrics, they will try to mimic those, right? So the idea essentially is that fraudsters are much more sophisticated with mimicking that behavior, because most of the time you would assume that, you know, if I already got a user, I see that the user is doing something in the app, it's a legit user, right? But we definitely see that emulators and bots can essentially perform human-like behavior within the app, right? So that's what we define as in-app event fraud.
Okay. Sorry, you have the part 2 of the question. Sorry.
Yeah, and the second part of the question, if you can remind me, it was about the geos, right? It was.
Yeah, it's just the particular geos or particular types of games.
Yeah, I think when it comes to the geos, you always have to remember that the fraudsters are where the money, they're following the money, right? So if you are, if we see tier 1 countries showing, you know, the best monetization, you know, they would try to mimic tier 1 users essentially, right? And in this case, it is definitely very much app specific, but different countries show different types of fraud, and maybe within the maybe I can actually find an additional report that we've done a few months ago and post in the chat, in the PCG chat, right, that we're going to have throughout the
you can put it in
the days, right? Yeah. So let me just try to find it and post because we had an interesting kind of visualization in terms of different geo-specific fraud, essentially.
Cool. All right. There's loads more questions, but I'm going to have to push on now. But there is, if Alex, if you've got a few minutes, you could drop into the Discord group and maybe you can get answers, field a few more questions there if you want, or if you haven't, then I'm sure they can catch you later at the event. But thank you so much, Alex, for your time. It's very informative. And yeah. Look forward
Thank you very much, guys.
Later, baby. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Chris. Bye-bye.
This is all round applause, I'm afraid. No, I haven't worked that bit out yet. Excellent.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.